with Allison Camerata and John Berman.
Welcome to our viewers in the United States and all around the world. This is a special edition of New Day. It's Monday, August 5th at 6 o'clock here in New York. Allison is off. Erica Hill joins me live from El Paso in Texas. 20 people were murdered behind Erica in the name of white supremacy, police say. And the question this morning is really, America, what are you going to do about it? Congress, what are you going to do about it? Mr. President, what are you going to do about it? 9 people were murdered in Dayton, Ohio. The question this morning is, America, what are you going to do about it? Congress, what are you going to do about it? Mr. President, what are you going to do about it? After spending the weekend at his Gulf resort, the president will address the nation this morning. Will he propose new gun safety measures? Will he call the attack in El Paso white supremacist terror? What message has it sent to white nationalists that he has chosen so far not to do so? This morning, Senate Democrats are asking to return to Washington to vote on 2 measures to expand background checks that passed the House with bipartisan support. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell hasn't even allowed a vote on them. Will that change this morning? We should note we invited dozens of Republican leaders from Texas, Ohio, and beyond to discuss the situation with us this morning. None of them agreed to appear. That list includes Texas Senators John Cornyn and Ted Cruz, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, and House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy.
Well, here in El Paso, among the questions which are left unanswered this morning, who are the 20 victims? That's because authorities still have not identified everyone who was shot and killed, and that wait for their families is agonizing. The alleged gunman is in custody. Police say he's volunteering information and showing no remorse. Shootings, we begin our coverage here in El Paso with Rosa Flores.
Erica, good morning. I've been in this community for the past few hours. I attended a vigil trying to learn more about this community, and there's profound pain. One of the things that I learned from just talking to people at this vigil were from Latinas who said that for the first time in their lives, in their community, they feel threatened because of the color of their skin.
To kill Hispanics. The president had time to crash a wedding at his Gulf resort this weekend, but not time to address the nation. Why? Why hasn't he named the El Paso attack as a white supremacist terror? He speaks in a few hours. What meaning will his words have now? That's next. This morning, why hasn't the president called the attack in Texas white supremacist terror? Ted Cruz has. Many Republicans have. What will the president say this morning? And frankly, will it change anything? Can it change his past positions? The White House, as of this morning, says none of this is the president's fault.
This was a sick person. The person in Dayton was a sick person. No politician is to blame for that.
I want to bring in Caitlin Dickerson, national immigration reporter for the New York Times and a CNN contributor, John Avlon, CNN senior political analyst, and Laura Barone Lopez, national political reporter for Politico. John, you know it's glib. Sometimes after these shootings, we often say there's a search for answers. There's no search for answers this morning. We have the answers. We know exactly why this suspected terrorist drove 12 hours to kill Hispanics, because he told us, police say, in that screed he wrote. We also know that his words are the same words that the president has used in the past. That's right. I can't tell you directly that he did it because the president said it, but I can tell you they used the same words. That brings us to this morning. The president will address the nation this morning. As of now, he hasn't called this terrorism. He hasn't called it an act of white supremacy. What can he say today that matters? And I lead into that question with the Washington Post editorial this morning. He says, we know by now not to waste time calling on President Trump to do the right thing. He sows division and bigotry rather than promoting unity and understanding.
He sows division and bigotry rather than promoting unity and understanding. This is the President of the United States we're talking. And you can draw a direct line, unfortunately, with the rhetoric the President has used and what we hear from these shooters in their so-called online manifestos, and not just the one in El Paso. So words are insufficient because the President's got a gaping credibility gap on the issue of confronting white supremacist terrorism. He always says we need to call out Islamist terrorism for what it is. If that's true, we certainly need to do it now, faced with this epidemic of violence we're seeing in the copycat killings we're seeing cascade. Words are not going to be enough. He's going to need to take action. He's going to need to use his bully pulpit to try to change the debate in Washington. Today we see the New York Post advocating for banning weapons of war. That's a significant sea change for a conservative paper. Got that right there. So that's the kind of thing that's going to matter. Will Mitch McConnell here? Will Republicans ditch their fealty to the NRA? This isn't a moment for presidential leadership. Unfortunately, we would be fools to expect the president to actually take a stand beyond words. And words are not enough right now.
One note, a lot of people are noting that the Rupert Murdoch-owned New York Post is calling for a ban on assault weapons this morning. The Rupert Murdoch-owned Fox News, they could call on a ban for language like invasion. And invaders. That has not happened yet.
But they've participated in that language.
So perhaps trying to have it a little bit of both ways there. Caitlin, I want to go to you on the language the president will use today. Does it matter?
I think it matters in terms of 2020. I think it matters in terms of speaking to the public now who are looking to the president to acknowledge what's happened. Does it matter, though, in terms of addressing all the people who he's roused in his rallies for years now and who've gotten excited about the idea of trying to stop what they believe to be an invasion? I think the problem is that the president talks about things like an invasion. He brings up very strong emotions for people. People at rallies, he's asked during his rallies, there's an invasion coming. What do you guys think that we should do? And there was a time when somebody yelled out, shoot them.
Let's play that. We have that.
Deal with this invasion, and this is one of them that we're looking at now. And so I think his words do matter, but I think that, I certainly know from Twitter and what I hear from people all the time that there are a lot of people who espouse the views of the shooter.
There's a phrase called stochastic terrorism that I think a lot of us have learned in the last 48 hours. The use of language to incite random actors to carry out violent or terrorist acts that are statistically predictable but individually unpredictable. In other words, no one ordered this guy in Texas to go murder Hispanics, but over time, language that is used can lead to people carrying out acts. That is something that can happen. And Laura, I've been struck by how many conservatives and Republicans have come out in the last 24 hours and called this terrorism, called it white supremacist terror, called it by its name. And we haven't heard the president yet. Now, he may say it at 10, but there's also the question of what does that delay mean? What message does the fact that the president's waited 48 hours to call it white supremacist terror mean? If you're a white nationalist, what do you take away from that?
Right. Well, this is a pattern with President Trump. It's one that we saw in the aftermath of Charlottesville. It's one that we saw after the Christchurch, New Zealand massacre as well. And to Caitlin's point, from the moment that he announced his candidacy for the White House, Trump has spoken about black, brown, Muslims as the other, people that look like me, people that look like Caitlin. And that language is something that has become more mainstream or has been out there more in the mainstream because of the fact that he has repeated it, because of the fact that he specifically talks about Mexicans and Latino immigrants as people who are invading the U.S. And so, if anything, it just continually potentially sends a message to white nationalists and white supremacists that it's okay to hold these views.
And he can't undo the things he has said in the past this morning, no matter what he says. That doesn't mean the president shouldn't come out and make a strong statement today, and maybe he will. He comes out and speaks at 10 o'clock. Well, wait, I don't expect, John, that he'll call for a ban on white supremacist terror like he called it a Muslim ban.
No, but again, let's see if he even starts to rise to the occasion. And again, it's not just words, it's actions. One of the first things he did as president was to overturn an Obama-era ban on the mentally ill getting weapons, a background check that was in place. So this is a persistent problem that he has sown not just by his words, but by his actions. You reap what you sow. This American carnage we're confronting today is partly the result of what he has sown.
American carnage, his own words.
Correct.
From the inauguration. Caitlin, the Senate on its plate has two bipartisan gun control measures that were passed in the House. One of them, it would be H.R. 8, the bipartisan background check of 2019. It requires a background check nearly for every firearm. So what it really does is background checks for gun show. It closes the gun show loophole there. And the other measure would extend to 10 days the waiting period from 3 days. This receives some Republican support in the House. It passed with 240 votes. I don't know if it will pass the Senate. I do know that it hasn't had a vote because Mitch McConnell has chosen not to allow the Senate to vote on these measures, which by no means are the most restrictive gun control measures.
I think we're in a bit of a unique situation right now, and I don't want to suggest that we have any evidence that the pattern is going to change and that legislative change will happen or political change more broadly will happen. But there are a few things that are about these situations that are unique right now. So one thing is that gun control groups are catching up with funding from wealthy donors like Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York. They are catching up to the NRA and are putting Democrats under a lot of pressure. And they're saying it's not enough anymore to lay this at the feet of Mitch McConnell. You have to go further. What's also unique is that we have all of the Democratic candidates at this point unanimously stepping forward and saying that they support tighter restrictions on gun control. And so I think that those two things make it possible that you could potentially shake something loose. At the very least, I think that when you have these several mass shootings that happen over the weekend, you have Ohio, you have El Paso, you had a shooting in Chicago, that I think moderate voters are now taking a pause, and they're thinking about these policy ideas and really putting pressure.
Laura, any chance that Mitch McConnell brings the Senate back to vote on these House measures that are sitting there just waiting?
Well, so far there's no indication that Majority Leader McConnell will bring back the Senate, and we also haven't heard from Speaker Pelosi about whether or not she would try to bring back the House to put some pressure on McConnell. So right now it's looking like there's a very good chance that they don't come back.
All right, Laura, John, Caitlin, thank you very much. We're going to have live coverage of the president's address this morning. You can watch it here on CNN. Judge for yourself the words he chooses now and if they are sufficient. Then tonight, former Vice President Joe Biden talks guns, white nationalists, and Donald Trump in an exclusive interview with Anderson Cooper. That's tonight at 8 o'clock. Supremacist terror. Those are words the president has yet to use to describe the attack in El Paso over the weekend that killed 20 people. An Anglo man, as the sheriff in El Paso said, who drove 10 hours to kill Hispanics. The president has used the words neither white supremacist nor terror. What is the impact? Joining me now is Jonathan Greenblatt. He is the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. And Jonathan, it's very nice to have you on this morning. As I was saying, as you're walking on, someday we'll get to talk in a different situation where it isn't quite so painful. What do you think the president has to say this morning? Do you think he needs to call this attack white supremacist terror?
Yes, I think there are a few things, John, that we need to think about today. First and foremost, our hearts ache for the victims in El Paso as well as those in Dayton, so we need to keep those people centered in front of our minds. I think secondly, as we talk about the president, keep in mind that today is the anniversary of the 2012 attack in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where a man, a white supremacist, burst into a Sikh temple and murdered 6 worshipers. Right, so white nationalism, this brand of violent extremism, it existed before President Trump, and yet words have consequences. And so it's not even what he says today at 10 o'clock, although there's something he needs to say, that white supremacy is a global terror threat, but it's what he says afterwards. It says he reinforced the message in an authentic way, because for far too long, the language that he's used, invaders, describing people as rapists and murderers, talking about open borders, these are literally staples of white supremacist rhetoric. And the idea that they're coming from our commander-in-chief is shocking.
I remember back after Charlottesville, David Duke sent out a message thanking President Trump for the language he chose to use and chose not to use.
Right.
So my question this morning is, it's been 2 days
Right.
since this white supremacist terror attack in Texas. If you're a white nationalist, what do you read from the president's reticence to use those words?
Well, we know at ADL, because we've been tracking hate for a long time, that extremists feel emboldened in this moment because literally, as you said, the president's silence actually speaks volumes. So it's what he said and how he sort of vacillated after Charlottesville. It's when after Christchurch, when questioned about white supremacy, he said he didn't think it was really a problem. And we've seen this pattern repeat itself. Last week, after the killings in Gilroy, right, which another person motivated by white supremacist ideology, one of the most prominent extremists, he wrote on his website, "This is the white nationalism we elected the president for." He said that after Gilroy and after the president's comments about the 4 Congresswomen. So the president, by not saying something, is sending a message. He can clear that up today, but again, today is just the beginning. Unfortunately, I think it's a little bit too late because the messages he's been sending for the last few years are the reason why these people feel so emboldened.
So 8chan, which is something that you've written about extensively, spoken about extensively, which is this website that has served as the host for so many of these hateful, terroristic thoughts. Cloudflare, which is the security apparatus that was hosting the site, they stopped working for 8chan this morning. So at least for now, you can't get on. Is that enough?
Well, it's a start. So let's keep in mind what 8chan is. We often use services like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, right? 8chan is sort of the septic tank of the internet. It's a cesspool for some of the worst elements in our society to talk about things like child pornography and violent extremism and the ideology around it. But there's a whole value chain that makes services like 8chan work. So Cloudflare's done something really important because by refusing to provide online security, the service is actually down this morning. And there's other things that could be done. The banks and the financial institutions which allow dollars to flow into these services, they should shut them down. The hosting companies that put them up online should shut them down. You know, at the ADL, we really see that the front line in fighting hate is really the internet. All of us can take steps to stop it.
I know at the ADL, I'll have to tell you, the hate existed before the internet. Hate will exist after the internet, but you don't have to make it easier.
That's exactly correct. Yeah, there has always been intolerance. That isn't new. What's new is that it's just a few clicks away, and that's something we can prevent.
All right, Jonathan Greenblatt, thank you for coming in this morning, helping us understand the impact of words. Unfortunately, again, as you said to me as you were coming in, this wasn't unpredictable.
No. Not at all. And in fact, in its predictability is what's the problem, why I hope the president today and other leaders across the spectrum speak out.
All right, Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go back to Eric in El Paso.
John, a rush of shooting victims coming into an emergency, learning more about the victims whose lives were tragically cut short when a gunman opened fire in Dayton, Ohio. And we are also learning more about the heroic actions that saved lives. Joining me now is Dr. Peter A.K. He's a trauma doctor and medical director for Miami Valley Hospital's trauma program, and also Dr. Randy Marriott, an emergency physician at Miami Valley Hospital. Doctors, we appreciate you both joining us this morning. Dr. A.K., when you got word of what had happened and the patients that were coming your way, what was your initial thought?
Well, I was called in. I was not actually on call. One of my colleagues was here along with the rest of the trauma team. So I was at home, and as a level 1 trauma center, we do have a system of backup. So I had to come in from home and was here within a few minutes.
Able to be there within a few minutes. I know, Dr. Marriott, as I understand it, you've been with Miami Valley Hospital for some 25 years nearly. Has there been a shooting event like this in recent memory in Dayton, or that you've had to deal with in the past?
No. This number is unprecedented.
And in terms of preparation, obviously as a level 1 trauma center, there's a certain level of training that's always happening. But to prepare for something like this, how often are you going through those trainings, especially as we're seeing more shootings throughout the country?
Right. Well, there's been a concerted regional effort to have training for active shooter response. We have a metropolitan medical response system, an MMRS here in the Dayton area, and that has brought together the first responders, including fire and EMS, law enforcement, public health, hospitals, etc. And we've all trained together over several years. We've had a number of active shooter exercises, most recently of which was last fall, which actually had a number of live moulage victims coming into our hospital under similar circumstances. So I think we're fairly well rehearsed. In addition to that, as a level 1 trauma center, we see a number of simultaneous incidents, and at times we'll have 4, 5, 6 victims at one time coming in within a short period of time. So that experience lends itself to being able to respond to what happened early Sunday morning.
That being said, there must still be, you're in there, you're doing your job, as we know, Dr. AK, but there must be a moment, especially as you called in and then came in from home. Was there a moment where you thought to yourself, I just watched coverage of something else or read about this in Texas, and now here I am at my own hospital in Dayton, and this is what's happening? Did that go through your mind, Dr. AK?
Yes, certainly. You don't know what to expect. But I came into the emergency department and saw the whole team ready to go. And it was clear that all the months and even years of drills really came into play because the staff acted very professionally and very effectively early that morning to deal with the patients that came in.
Dr. Marietta, you were talking about some of the training that you'd even had recently and training that overlaps with first responders. There's also an emotional component to this, though, for first responders, for physicians who are in these emergency room situations. How do you handle that with your staff on the heels of an event like this?
Well, I first of all, I'd like to say the first responders acted just extraordinarily. The police were able to neutralize this shooter in very, very rapid fashion. The fire and EMS folks came in very quickly behind them. They were able to get the victims out of that hot zone and get them rapidly transported. Our staff acted admirably. By the time I got there, most everyone had been taken care of, and that was 14 victims in, at that point, probably a span of less than 15 minutes. So again, everyone acted to the highest standard. As far as the aftermath, there's certainly going to be some emotional issues afterward as we find out more about who these individuals were in their place and roots in our community. It's going to become harder. I think we rely on each other first and foremost. I think peer support is what is most called for here, and we're doing our best to give support to one another, to the first responders, the police officers. And I think as a community, that's where we get our most support and how we heal the best.
Dr. Randy Marriott, Dr. Peter AK, I appreciate you both joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
The shooting
Do this morning.
It's so hard to predict because of his record, because he has sowed that division, because he's been such a demagogue and a nativist and a political opportunist, that he has failed to seize a moment of potential leadership to speak out against hate, against white supremacy, about terrorism, about failing to call the kind of threat to the country that we're seeing what it is. We saw after 9/11 the country mobilized because the government was motivated and mobilized against the kind of hate that was directed against America on 9/11. We saw President Clinton speak for the nation and capture the anger and the hurt and the shock after the Oklahoma City bombing. But this is a different kind of leader who doesn't want to go big. And the great danger in this moment is that you yet again fail to get beyond the kind of template of our culture, our broadcast, cable, and social media culture that divides so many people, and to go big, to call the threat what it is, to call the problem what it is, and to mobilize the government and the people of the country to do something big. Again, I don't think this president has it in him because he spent so much time doing the opposite. And yet, as I was speaking to a veteran of a Republican administration recently, what the president says matters always, for good and for bad. And that's the test before him.
I don't think that's in any more direct relief than it is this morning. No question about that, David. On the other hand, Andrew Gillum, Beto O'Rourke had a moment last night which I think speaks to the frustration that many have when it comes to this president, and speaks to the frustration that many have when it comes to even asking the question, what can he say this morning to make it better? Listen to what former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who is running for president, said last night when asked, is there anything in your mind the president can do to make things better?
Is there anything in your mind that the president can do now to make this any better?
What do you think? You know the shit he's been saying. He's been calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals. I don't know, like members of the press, what the Hold on a second. it's these questions that you know the answers to. I mean, connect the dots about what he's been doing in this country. He's not tolerating racism. He's promoting racism. He's not tolerating violence. He's inciting racism and violence in this country. So, I don't know what kind of question that is.
Mayor Gillum, what do you make of that?
The President of the United States has forfeited any moral ground under which he could lead this country at this time in this really painful moment where people really are looking for leadership, moral clarity. Absolutely, he should call this what it is, white supremacist terrorism in this country. But the truth is that he may not have loaded the gun, but he absolutely is responsible for the bullets. He has sown seeds of hatred, and that's not an overreaction. When you call people rapists, roaches, when you dehumanize people, when you say that there is equivalency on both sides, when you're talking about racists and people who act against them, these are the kinds of seeds that this president has sown using words like an invasion, a military-style word. And then you get surprised when someone decides to take you seriously, pick up arms, military-style arms, drive 8 hours to go and mow down the people who you've told them are invading this country. And then you think at 10 o'clock today we're supposed to listen to your words and believe that you have some emotional connection to the traumatic loss that people are feeling right now. This is crazy. What I want to hear from this president is I want to hear a plan. Yes, you ought to call this what it is, but you also ought to call Congress back to Washington, D.C. You ought to ask them not only to pass the most anemic form of gun reform by having background checks become universal, but you should also call for a ban on assault-style weapons of war. You should also, Mr. President, call for the Congress to ban these kinds of weapons and put limits on the kind of size of artillery that can be put into these guns. And I don't want to hear anybody say anything about good people being able to have a gun and respond to these incidences. It took 30 seconds for 9 people to be killed and over 20 other folks to be injured last night, 30 seconds before law enforcement could respond. That was the quickest response that any of us could have asked for. Yet there's carnage all over the place. And the president has to take responsibility for that and demonstrate some real leadership for a change.
So, Governor McAuliffe, the president moments ago floated what appears to be some kind of deal on background checks here. He said Republicans and Democrats must come together to get strong background checks, perhaps marrying this legislation with desperately needed immigration reform. Now, I do want to note, before I ask you to weigh in here,
sure,
there is background check legislation that's passed the House with some Republican votes that is sitting and waiting in the U.S. Senate for action right now. But Mitch McConnell has chosen not to act. It would expand background checks to gun shows, close the loophole in some person-to-person sales, and it will extend the waiting period from 3 to 10 days. So that legislation exists. All it takes is a vote.
That's it. And you asked what the president should do today. I remind you that we are exactly 1 week away from the 2nd anniversary of Charlottesville, where that day the President of the United States should have stood up in front of the cameras and condemned white supremacy and the neo-Nazis. I talked to him that day. He said he was going to do it. He refused, did not do it at the end of the day. So here we are 2 years later. We're in a very similar situation. So the president has to do 2 things in my mind today. He ought to get up in front of the cameras. And number one, I know this is hard for Donald Trump, but he ought to apologize. And he ought to say to the American public, my rhetoric has gone too far. And I'm asking all Americans to come together. I'm speaking to the young people today. Stand down. Stop the hatred. And he ought to say, listen, I'm responsible for some of this, and I was wrong. That would go a long way. And as David talked about what presidents do in a very important time in our nation's history, this is a big moment for Donald Trump. He has to change. Can he do it? I really don't know. The second thing he needs to do is look in the camera today, and we're talking about all this guns legislation. He ought to say, I want the Senate and the House to come back immediately. I'm looking to Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, and say to him on camera, Mitch McConnell, I want you to call a vote. We've got to have universal background checks. We've got to shut the gun show loophole. We've got to get rid of these assault weapons. We've got to get rid of these high-capacity magazines. That's what the president should do. And if he puts the Republicans in the Senate very much right there and say, you have to do this, because they do whatever he wants and they never speak up. Even though I disagree with him, they never speak up. This is a time for him to show real leadership. I'm sorry for the grief that I've caused. I mean, think of it. This is the first time a president goes before the nation and there's a question of whether he is culpable for the issues that he's about to address. Usually a president gets up to be the moral leader. This time the president has some responsibility because of his words. This is a big moment for President Trump. He ought to stand up and do the right thing and turn our country around and bring us together.
David, I'm out of time, so in 10 seconds or less, any chance he stands up and actually says he's sorry, A, and B, to the question of action in the Senate, given that this legislation exists, might this be, after everything we've seen in the years, the moment where some kind of deal could be struck?
I don't think the president has it in him to what Terry's talking about, but he has an ability to direct a national conversation, to talk about the issue of guns, to talk about hate, white supremacy, to really get a focus on what government can do and have that extend into our kind of how tribal we've become, how easy we will demonize each other in our media structures today. He's got that potential. He's got the audience. Will he use it?
We're done with talking. Let's do something.
Time for solutions. No more of a search for question or search for answers. It's the time for solutions. Governor Terry McAuliffe, Mayor Andrew Gillum, David Gregory, I really do appreciate your time this morning. Up next, what message does one of the president's most vocal supporters have for him hours before the president addresses the nation? Hours, President Trump will address the nation from the White House, delivering his response to the two mass shootings over the weekend. A lot of people are taking issue with the explosive rhetoric he has used, rhetoric that mirrors the screed written by the El Paso murderer. This is language the president has used since his campaign began. Listen.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. These are rough people in many cases. And if they're allowed to break through our borders, only larger and bigger, we have emboldened these people. It's not going to happen. Yes, sir, we have barbed wire going up because you know what? We're not letting these people invade our country.
Invade, invasion, the very language that was in the screed written by this killer in El Paso. Joining us now is Anthony Scaramucci, former White House Communications Director, author of Trump, the Blue-Collar President. Anthony, thank you for being with us this morning. I can tell you've been doing a lot of thinking over the weekend about all of this.
John, good morning.
You know, these are issues facing the country right now. And again, I know you've been struggling with them as well, issues of hate and issues of gun violence. If we can, I would like to separate the two in our discussion this morning a little bit. First, to the president's speech this morning. We just heard former Governor Terry McAuliffe say the president should apologize to the nation for some of the language he has used and the language that appeared in that killer's screed in El Paso. Is there any chance of that in your mind?
Well, you know, I don't think the president's going to apologize. He spent 40 or 50 years with a strategy of never apologizing. He's probably apologized a few times in his life, but this will likely not be one of those times. But I think what's instructive here, and hopefully people around him are telling him this, when you're sending out tweets that can be perceived as racist, again, not saying he's racist, but can be perceived, or you're saying things that can be perceived as white nationalists, what ends up happening is you get a group of people that are pretty fired up. Also, go back through history. The presidency is a bully pulpit. Teddy Roosevelt said that you could use it to control the news cycle, and you could use it as a gigantic worldwide megaphone to express your ideas and your values. And so what's happening now is, unfortunately, we have lunatics and there's mental illness in our society. It's very, very painful to watch that. And so when a president uses rhetoric that, frankly, he doesn't even need to use, you know, he's got so many good things going on in the economy, there would be no need to use this sort of rhetoric. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the speech. But, you know, John, what I would tell you is that the NRA is basically an emperor without clothing right now. And what Terry McAuliffe said is totally true. The president could use his strength with the Republican Party and get something done on these gun control laws.
And I do want to talk about guns, because you have a different position, frankly, than the president has on guns and the Republican Party has, and you've held that position for a long time. And we'll come to that. But on the language, it was interesting. You were describing the threat that language can pose. There's a phrase for that has developed over the last few years, this stochastic terror. It's the notion that no one ordered this person to go commit the terror attack, but over time, statistically speaking, attacks will happen if people in power, if people who have a megaphone use this language, because these evil people will use it as an excuse. Do you see that happening here?
Well, there's definitely linkage, but I think it would be unfair to blame the president. You can't say that it's the president's fault that there's a mentally ill person.
Well, but
that
it's his fault. You agree that it's his fault he's chosen the words.
People,
but it's only his fault that he has chosen the word invaders,
but it is,
correct?
yes. But he should not be using those words. He's the leader of the free world. Mm-hmm. The country stands for these ideas. The first name of the country is United. It's not disunited. It also stands as a beacon of hope for civilization around the world. Lincoln called it the last best hope for mankind. So he is the successor of Abraham Lincoln. He has to handle himself and comport his language in a way that would let people see him in that way. And so when you're saying stuff like this, or you're tweeting stuff about Elijah Cummings' robbery, it's just nonsensical. And if you're saying, well, I need to do that because people are up against me in the media, or I need to do that because I'm combating things, it's nonsensical. You won the presidency. You've got a great hand, and you've got great policies going on around the country.
As a supporter.
Knock it off. There's no reason to do it.
As a supporter of the president, when you see the language that he uses in this document written by the killer, how does it make you feel, Anthony?
Well, again, forget about the killer for a second. Just look at the language itself. You can't attach the killer to the president. That is totally, in my opinion, not fair. But if you just look at the language itself, and if you're sitting around with him putting a speech together, or you're sitting around with him thinking about a campaign idea or a campaign policy, you can say, hey, you're the president now. You're not running for office. I mean, you're the president of everybody. Right. This sort of stuff is going to turn off a lot of people,
Anthony,
and it's going to strike fear in people.
It's going to. It has. But let me just ask this now.
Making the point,
why does he do it? Why
you're making
does
the point
he do
that
it?
It incited the guy.
I'm not making that point. I'm saying it's the same language. I'm asking you how it makes you feel. Okay. Why does the president use this language? Because it's a choice. It's a choice, and it's a choice over a long period of time.
Look, he would have to answer that question. I can only surmise that he thinks that there's value to creating this sort of combativeness and this sort of combustibility. He thinks it's value to his base, that it's perhaps stoking them up. I mean, I think one of the fears that they would have, if you look at the polling numbers, that they have to get the base out with the highest level of participation possible. And so he may be thinking that this sort of stuff is helping his base. I would argue otherwise. I would say that his base is probably with him. He needs to attract moderates and independents and rebuild a coalition to win in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. And I think the way he's going about it with this sort of rhetoric and this sort of nastiness doesn't make any sense. If he makes a speech today and says, look, the Republicans, we all know, they're basically a bunch of fraidy cats in the Congress. They never say boo about me. And so since I totally control them, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pass background check legislation. We're going to increase the opportunity for red flag laws and things like that. They'll sign that. He'll get Democrats to come over and get that thing done. And now that's more of a moderate independent view, and that's the coalition that he needs to win re-election. So I don't know. Look, he's the president. I'm not the president. He has way better political instincts than me. But let me tell you something, okay? I have studied the historical documents of the country, and I have lived the American dream. Talking like this is not the best way to handle yourself as the American president. So, it is what it is. I hope he would stop doing it. People that really like him and want to support him, give us reasons to support you more and be faithful, passionate advocates. Don't do nonsensical things where we're all scratching our heads saying, okay, how are we going to support that when you're acting in a way that doesn't make sense, Anthony, and is potentially inciting violence?
Do you support the president as we sit here this morning?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
As we sit here this morning, do you still support President Trump?
Yeah, of course I support. Hey, John, I'm a very loyal guy. Remember, I got fired 2 years ago.
Loyalty is one thing, but the question is, Anthony, then, if the answer is yes, you still support the president this morning. What would it take?
I understand that.
What would it take for you to stop supporting the president?
I think he's going in a direction, and I said this a couple of weeks ago on your air. He's going in a direction where there's a very large group of people that actually want to support him, that are actually begging him to give us reasons to support you. He's going in a direction where I guess he doesn't want that support, or he wants people to have this twisted like a pretzel loyalty test with him, where he's going to do things that are not making any sense, but I want you to go out there and sort of defend it, okay? And so I think there's a large group of people that are going to stop doing that. And then eventually people are going to say, look, I'm sorry, the value system and the rhetoric does not outweigh the policies, okay? And so at some point that will happen, and has not happened for me yet, but there's a lot of us out here. It's not just me. I'm a little bit more vocal, perhaps a tinge more courageous to admit it. But trust me, it's former White House administration officials, it's former cabinet members, it's former people in the American military. It's not just me. It's not like I'm the only one. I may be the only one saying it, but trust me, there's a very large group of people. If he keeps it up, they'll say, okay, the policies, they're great, but you know what? This sort of rhetoric and this sort of disunity sort of stuff is overpowering the policy. So
he's at risk.
Why can't you get them both together and figure it out? That's something I don't understand.
He's at risk of losing.
What's that?
He's at risk, you think, of losing former cabinet officials?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's not even a question about that. What he's at risk of doing is a very large group of people, moderates, independents, Republicans that want to support him, not the Republicans that are like making these anti-end pretzels. I mean, there's a lot of guys in Congress, when they leave Congress, they're going to go to the shopping mall and buy a pretzel franchise. I mean, these guys are jokes. I mean, you gotta tell the guy the truth. You got to tell him where things are at, because at the end of the day, it's disunifying, and you are the leader of the free world, and you are running the United States of America. It's united for a reason. So yes, to me, I support him. I hope he gives a speech today. The NRA is an emperor without clothing. Obviously, these guys fall in line with the president. Anything he says or does, they support on Twitter or elsewhere. Just tell these guys we're going for universal background checks and end the political nonsense. 75% of the American people are in support of that. That's your coalition.
Yep, and the House has already passed 2 laws to expand background checks. The Senate could do it today. Anthony Scaramucci, thank you for being with us this morning. And I think it's notable that Anthony says, Erica, as we go back to you in El Paso, Republican are calling on Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to reconvene the Senate to take action. Our next guest is one of those lawmakers. Joining us now is Democratic Senator and presidential candidate Kirsten Gillibrand. Senator, thank you for being with us this morning. If I can get your reaction first to the news of just a few minutes ago where the president said we need to expand background checks. Do you agree?
Of course we do. And this president needs to take a lot more responsibility than that. He's been emboldening white supremacists his entire presidency and his campaign. He's been using language to demonize immigrants, to demonize the vulnerable his entire presidency. He was at a rally in Florida where he's talking about immigrants, and he said, what should we do? What should we do? And someone shouts out, shoot them. And he laughed. That is what a lack of leadership in the White House looks like. And he is not only egging on white supremacy and white nationalism, but he is one himself. And he has been using racist language as a candidate and as president for 2 years, especially against immigrants. He called Mexicans rapists. He demonizes them every time he talks about immigrants.
I want to talk about the epidemic of hate in this country because I think it's so important. But first, specifically on the issue of guns, the president suggested linking background check measures to immigration measures. Is that something, as a Democratic vote in the Senate, you would ever consider?
It's absurd. Why would, again, this is part of the problem. He's linking issue of basic common sense gun reform that we should be going back into the Senate today to vote on with this issue of immigration, because again, he continues to try to demonize people seeking asylum, people needing our help.
And there are two measures that did pass the House. One that would extend the waiting period from 3 to 10 days. The other that would close the gun show loophole and expand, not make it universal background checks, but expand them greatly. Would you vote yes on those House measures that passed?
For sure.
And it may not be enough. You want more than that, yes?
Right. We should ban the assault weapons, and we should ban the large magazines. We should have a federal anti-gun trafficking law, as well as universal background checks. Those are the three most common sense ideas that are supported on a bipartisan basis. We could get that done. And Mitch McConnell should call the Senate back in today, and we should pass these measures.
Yeah, there are two that are just sitting there waiting. I mean, there are others that may be more controversial. These are not the controversial ones that are sitting and waiting for a Senate vote that the Senate Majority Leader won't allow on the House floor, even to count the numbers. Now, on the issue of hate, the language that has been used in this country over the last few years is something I don't remember. I don't remember in my lifetime having it be so public and so out there.
Right.
What should the president say this morning, and does it matter?
Yes, it matters. He's the president. He has a bully pulpit. His responsibility is to set the tone for America. And what he's done is spew hate and division his entire presidency. The incidents of hate crimes have risen all across the country. Incidents of racism, homophobia, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant has risen. And he is responsible for creating the climate where this has flourished. These social media groups, the fact that the head of 8chan closed it down today because he at least recognized that this group was inspiring and inciting white supremacy and violence based on race. He is at least taking responsibility. Our president hasn't taken responsibility on any level, and he must. He must actually do what it takes. I read a piece this morning about, imagine this was from anti-Islamic. Imagine that kind of hate crime and what this country would do to respond to it. It would be everything. And the president would shut down the social media groups. The president would use every weight and power of the federal government to make a difference. That's true. And in this instance, he's done nothing. All he's done is pour fuel on a flame that has been burning since he got elected.
One of the things people have pointed to is the president was very critical of President Obama for not using the words radical Islamic terrorism to describe some terrorist attacks that were perpetrated by Muslims. So why is it that he hasn't in the last few days used the phrase white supremacist terrorism to describe this?
Because he doesn't lead, and he is part of the problem. He is the one that is inciting this violence and inciting this hate. If I was president, I would use my Department of Justice to actually investigate white supremacy, to make sure that we knew what these groups were doing. I would make sure we'd infiltrate these groups to make sure we could stop these kinds of terrorist attacks. This is what domestic terrorism looks like. And you should be using our resources, the Department of Justice, our investigative arms with the FBI, to actually root out this kind of terrorism at home.
One of the things that supporters of the president say is even if he goes out there this morning and calls it white supremacist terror, he'll still be criticized for other things he's done in the past, so why bother? I'm just telling you what they would say.
Leadership is leadership, and we are in desperate need of it. This president is unwilling to change the climate of this country. As I've said, he's used his speeches to demonize immigrants. He calls it an invasion. He's been doing that since his candidacy, straight through his presidency. And so it's no wonder that these white supremacist groups are using violence to stop what President Trump continues to incite. It's his responsibility to change the national narrative and to decry this kind of racism.
Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, thanks for being with us this morning. I appreciate it.